The religious love to say, well, you wouldn't believe it even if you saw it with your own eyes. Well, why don't you give that a shot and we'll see? Because the religious never have anything of demonstrable substance to present, and that's really the problem. They're just full of hot air. So let's get to another example of that coming up next. We haven't done Frank Turek for a while. Not that he doesn't already have tons of videos out there, but Frank, once you realize his shtick, he's really kind of a worthless waste of time, right? Granted, all of them are, because they all have the same problems, but Frank is blatantly obvious about it once you learn to see his tells. So let's get to a question and see if he can provide anything but meaningless excuses. My magic 8 ball says no, but I guess we'll have to go and see.
So I have an atheist, or I should say agnostic friend. He basically has problem with any kind of scripture or religion. So when asking questions about God and religion, one of the concerns he has, he tends to make this about very personal about himself, meaning if Jesus died and all these witnesses witnessed this death and resurrection, they got to witness it. But why can't that happen today? Why can't some prophet can raise people from the dead today so that I can see it?
That kind of went on for a while, didn't it? I just let him run on because he never came up for air and took a breath. I think that's a valid question, though. First off, all we have of these other things are claims made in a book of mythology. There is no evidence that any of it ever happened at all, which means there were no eyewitnesses because the events likely never happened in the first place. We know that the books of the Bible, the Gospels especially, were written anonymously, and if you actually see something with your own eyes, you don't need to go out and copy the vast majority of your own supposed account from someone else. So we're already starting off with a lot of problems. The religious have to assume things that are absolutely not in evidence because they just really want it to be true. That doesn't make any of it true, though. Secondly, I don't do the make it personal thing because I, as a person, don't matter in the pursuit of truth. And neither do you. Truth is what is out there beyond any human's ability to change. If humans had never existed at all, the truth would still exist. Truth does not depend on us, and that's something more people need to get through their heads. Truth doesn't need you, period. Now, I think he's still got something more to say. Maybe it's worth responding to, and maybe it's not. We'll just have to wait and see. Then it's on to Frank's inevitable stupidity. Won't that be fun?
And of course, I mean, you can point to the fact that Jesus said, blessed are those who didn't see but still believe. But he goes back to the fact that a Bible is written by some guy, it could be a myth. And so what kind of approach would you recommend in that kind of situation?
It just goes on and on and on, doesn't it? I won't respond though because, why the hell not? Because that's really the problem, and I'm sure Frank will just run around with the goalposts to avoid having to address it. All you people have is a book of mythology that you cannot back up independently with verifiable evidence. I have no reason whatsoever to take you seriously. No reason at all. But here's what I figure that Frank is going to do, just because I like to try to read the Apologists, because it's usually painfully easy to do. He's going to just assert that the Bible is reliable, because really, what else can he do? Then he'll just assert that atheists will just ignore supposed modern miracles because we just want to sin or some stupid shit like that. It's all self-serving because that's what apologetics exists to do. It's not there to answer these questions rationally. It's there to comfort all the people in the audience so they keep putting their money in the collection plate or pay for tickets to get in the door or whatever. His job is not to find truth. He's terrified of truth. His job is to provide comfort and good enough sounding excuses such that the already religious stop asking impertinent questions and just believe. So let's see just how close I got.
Well, first of all, I might ask him how many things he believes that he hasn't seen.
What difference does that make? Now, speaking only for myself, since really who else can I speak for, but I believe things that have demonstrable evidence that they happened. I don't have to see the actual event in question. I just have to have verifiable evidence that it happened at all. And you'd think that Frank would understand that, since there are a whole ton of things that he believes that he has no actual demonstrable evidence for whatsoever. He just really wants it to be true, and because his big book of multiple choice says something and he just so happens to like it, it's just got to be true, so there. I am nothing at all like that. I need evidence, and where that evidence is lacking, I simply do not believe. I do not take a positive position on anything for which such a position is not warranted. Nothing is ever set in stone. We know what we know when we know it, and not one instant before. That's just not comforting for the religious, though, which is why they're so terrified admitting that they don't know. Because this isn't about the facts, it's about the feelings. And that, my friends, is absolutely pathetic.
Probably a lot.
Yeah, right. In fact, most of the things we believe in, we haven't seen. We take it on authority.
No, we don't. That might be you, but it's not me. That's why I don't give a damn about consensus. I don't care what any person says happened. I care what that person can prove happened with objectively verifiable evidence. There's a lot of stuff that's purportedly going on out there that can't be intellectually backed up. There are people who claim there's proof for the existence of Bigfoot. There are people who believe that alien abductions are real. And I don't care what they say. I care that they can bring that proof to the table, and when they can't, as the religious never can, I am simply not impressed. I am not going to believe it based on your own personal emotional say-so, because I don't care about you. I don't care about the experts. I care about the evidence. So if this is all Frank is going to do, which, let's be honest, it is, because he can never do anything else, then I am not going to be impressed. Then again, I never am impressed by Frank and all the other apologists, so, what the hell else is new, right?
Right. And so his own worldview, he believes many things that he hasn't seen evidence for, but he believes them anyway.
I don't. Now, there are a few things that have to be accepted without evidence because we really have no other choice, but we've been through that a ton of times, so I'm not going to do it again. But otherwise, I want to see the evidence for everything, or at least the things that I actually care about. I mean, there is stuff that I simply couldn't give a damn about, and if somebody comes out of the bathroom and says they did something, yeah, okay, dude, I don't want to see the evidence. I just don't care, go flush, ick. But if you're making claims about how the universe fundamentally works, and you're trying to convince me that it's true, then yes, I need to see that evidence. I need to know that you're not running on pure fifis and faith, and for the religious, that's pretty much all they're ever doing. They just really like the idea, and they really want it to be true. But I don't care what you want. I care what you can prove, and sadly for them, they can never prove anything. And that's why they're so unimpressive, because they're all just a bunch of emotional schmucks.
Now, the passage you just mentioned in John chapter 20, after Jesus shows himself to Thomas and he says, "Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believed," he's not saying they don't have evidence, because the very next verse, John says this: "These things were written down so that you may believe that Jesus is the Savior, and by believing in him, you may have life in his name.
All of which are just a bunch of unsupported claims. Sorry, that is never going to impress me, because anyone can just write stuff down. I can write down right now that invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies brought me a pizza, and I'm writing it so that you will know that the pixies are good and life-affirming and all kinds of other bullshit like that. Just because someone writes a thing down, that doesn't make it true. That's the whole point of demanding evidence. Not beliefs, not faith, evidence. So I don't have to trust anyone because humans are generally untrustworthy. I don't want anyone to trust me. Ask for verification. Seriously, just because I say a thing, that doesn't make it true. And that goes for absolutely everybody. Go check it out for yourselves. I am not an authority, and in fact, I don't think any actual authorities exist beyond reporting what they think themselves. Physics doesn't work the way that it works because Einstein or Hawking or anybody else said so. It is whatever it is because that's what the evidence says. What Einstein or Hawking or whoever says after the fact is because they've examined the evidence and they've come to conclusions based upon it. You need that evidence first. The people don't matter, the evidence does. Learn to deal.
In other words, the whole book of John is written as evidence.
That is not how that works. That's like saying that 7 books of Harry Potter were written as evidence that magic exists and there's a real school out there somewhere called Hogwarts. That is not going to convince anyone, at least I hope not. And the Bible shouldn't matter either. If in 2,000 years, maybe we've had a complete catastrophe and civilization has collapsed and all previous knowledge has been lost, if someone comes across a set of Harry Potter books locked in a vault somewhere, nobody ought to believe that any of it is true. The rational person says, how do I corroborate this objectively? One does not just read and believe, and if you do, you're an idiot. Sadly, there are way too many idiots out there, and Frank Turek is one of them.
As to why Jesus is the Savior, and therefore you then can make a decision to follow him.
I have no evidence whatsoever that he ever existed at all, at least not that he did some of the things he's reported to have done in your silly book of make-believe. That is not good evidence. It's just nonsense. Even if it was all true, at least the parts that could conceivably have evidence, even if they don't, but, for all the sort of real stuff, the birth, the death, the words, any of that that could be validated independently, that's still not a good reason to follow Jesus. There's still a lot that can't be validated, or at least I can't really imagine a way that it could be, and until it is, I'm not following anybody. Because I'm just not a follower. I have no interest in following anybody, period. I follow facts, not people. Not like I have a choice because they're facts regardless. I don't have to choose to follow gravity. Gravity's there no matter what I do. I can't just go, well, I'm not going to follow gravity today and just float off into the sky. It's entirely irrelevant to the actual reality in which I live. And maybe that's the reason I don't fall for any of this bullshit. Because that's all it is.
You can look at the evidence like we've been doing here to see, would they have made this up? Why would they have made it up?
You have no evidence. You only have claims that you just so happen to like and a lot of assumptions that are not independently verifiable, and that's the real problem here. We know that the Gospels weren't written by the disciples. They weren't written by eyewitnesses, but they have to believe that it was because otherwise their entirely irrational house of cards just collapses into a pile on the floor. They can't accept that because they're in this for the feels and not remotely for the reals, and their emotional comfort means more to them than anything else. That's why it all just falls apart the second that you look at it, because they are making it all about them and their feelings and their wishes and their dreams, but they're not making it about the truth, which excludes them entirely. That's why I keep saying that you have to take yourself completely out of the picture. I don't matter at all when it comes to the truth, because the truth exists entirely independently of me or anyone else. How I feel about it doesn't matter. And that's why this crap doesn't stick with me, because it's crap.
Why is Jesus of Nazareth the most influential human being in history if he didn't rise from the dead?
He isn't. The stories about him are influential, but Jesus, demonstrably, he never did anything to even move the needle. We have no evidence that Jesus was even real. That's like saying, why is Luke Skywalker influential? Well, Luke Skywalker isn't real, but there were a couple of movies that people really liked, and that's what made the idea of Luke Skywalker matter to at least some people. It's what makes the idea of Jesus matter to some people. It's not the real person, because you can't prove the real person exists. It's the idea that rose up about him down the road. And it's shocking just how many people can't figure this out, isn't it?
I mean, he comes from an obscure part of the Roman Empire. He was just an itinerant preacher who didn't travel more than 200 miles from where he lived. He never wrote a book. He never led an army. He never held office. He never did many of the things that would, from the ancient times, cause you to remember him, and yet now he's the center of the human race. Why is that?
He's not. He might be the center of your world, which is kind of pathetic when you think about it, but more people are walking away from Christianity today than at any other point in human history. This is nothing to be proud of, Frank. Your delusions don't matter. They never have, and they never will. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't mean anything. And just because you can fill a small room with a couple of people willing to pay to hear you speak doesn't mean anything either. This is just a vast overestimation of your imaginary friends and your own ridiculous faith. But that's really what this is all about, right? If you ask a Muslim, they're going to say Allah or Muhammad or something like that. Hindus will say Krishna or whatever. Buddhists will probably say Buddha. Why? Because that's what they see all around themselves. That doesn't make any of it actually true, at least the beliefs regarding it. It's what they really like, and because these people are running on nothing but fifis and faith, what they like is pretty much all they care about. And I find that utterly pathetic. How about you?
Because he rose from the dead. That's why.
You'd have to provide evidence for that, and I think we all know by now he simply can't do it. This is the big problem with the religious. They are just assuming things without being able to prove things. And for myself at least, claims mean absolutely nothing at all. I am not impressed with your claims. Not at all. I care only about your proof. I care only about the evidence that you can trot out and show me is actually true. And that's why Frank is up there in front of a bunch of people who already believe, instead of taking his dog and pony show on the road to, skeptic conventions, where they just laugh him right out the door. Nothing Frank is saying is at all impressive, and he doesn't care, because the dumb people in the audience are willing to pay him to just sit there and spout nonsense for an hour. That's the whole problem. His audience is stupid, and he's a con man. When you can lie for the Lord and get paid for it, why bother to try?
And the evidence, in fact, the alternative theories for this are evaporating. People don't have good alternative theories for explaining all the data. They just say, we don't know what happened to Jesus, but we're not going to say he rose from the dead.
Except we do. There is no reason whatsoever to think that any of this ever happened at all. Of course, Frank can't admit that because his paycheck depends on it. But if we're going to just go strictly by the evidence, which is exactly what I'm doing, then none of this is going to impress you at all. He's depending on people being just like he is, or at least just like his intended audience is, and the more people that aren't, the more of us that just laugh at his stupidity, the more of us who are skeptical and demand evidence, the worse people like Frank Turek look. Of course, he won't talk to people who weren't that dumb, because that's how he makes a living. He would never get up on a stage with someone who was just going to hold his feet to the fire constantly and demand that he had evidence. And that's why all of the religious debates that I see go so poorly for the religious, because they have no evidence to present. That's why Frank and every other apologist, they're all such laughable jokes.
Also, I might say that when people say, I would believe if I only saw with my own eyes, I don't buy that.
Of course you don't, because you can't capitalize on it. Here's the reality, though. I would believe if I saw it with my own eyes. At least that I saw it, not necessarily that it was actually going on. The problem is that he's got to staple a lot of assumptions on that are simply not evidentially supported. This is kind of where I figure he's going to go, assuming he ever gets to the modern miracle thing at all. He's going to get to the point of, well, I don't get it, therefore God, which is the standard gigantic argument from ignorance that the religious all do. And I'm sorry, but it just doesn't work that way. If you had a supposed miracle, let's just give him that for the moment, it doesn't mean God done it. You don't get to just leap to God. You have to prove God, and he simply can't do that. So a rational person, even if we accept that there was this thing that we couldn't understand or explain, that wouldn't mean God done it. Our answer would have to be, we don't know, because we don't know. And Frank can't accept that because Frank is a con man.
In fact, even in history, you look back at, let's just say the folks at the Exodus. They saw miracle after miracle, and then Moses goes up on the mountains for an extra few nights, and suddenly they're worshiping the golden calf. And you're going, what? In other words, miracles didn't always bring forth the kind of fidelity to Jesus or to God that you would think they would.
Except that Exodus stuff, it never happened at all. This is just mythology spread by the Jews as a means to explain their origins. There is no independently verifiable evidence to support any of it. There's no reason to think that Moses was a real person. Moses is a character dreamed up by the early Jews, most likely a version of the Syrian character Moses, who was found floating in a basket in a river, accompanied by stone tablets with written laws, and carried a rod that he used to perform miracles such as parting the waters and leading his people across the sea. Stuff like that. This is not hard to understand, but the religious, all religions really, simply demand that their own myths are actually true, even though they have no evidence whatsoever to support it. That's all just a load of bullshit, but they couldn't care less, could they?
And there are atheists today. In fact, it's Peter Atkins, who's an Oxford-trained, I think, biologist, who was asked recently on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Brierley. He's having a debate with Hugh Ross. And Hugh Ross was giving him evidence that God exists and all this, and he was just having none of it. And so Justin Brierley turned to him and said, what if Jesus appeared to you? Would you believe then? He said, no, I'd see my psychiatrist.
Because we know that hallucinations are a thing, but we have no evidence to think that gods are real. We would have to have significant corroboration that Jesus was actually real before accepting it as a legitimate candidate explanation. Now, I get that the religious are desperate to believe, but I'm not. I am only out there seeking the truth, and the truth requires direct, demonstrable support. I get that makes the job of the believer much more difficult, but that's only because they have irrationally leapt to conclusions that are not defensible to begin with. If they are seeking fact and truth up front, they would never have come to those conclusions in the first place. They're only fighting their way uphill because they're just idiots with an agenda. And that's their problem, not mine.
Right? It's like there's nothing that can convince some people. Sure. So I think God gives people enough evidence to believe, but he also gives them enough distance so they could go their own way.
So Frank is just making excuses for why the evidence, in big air quotes, that he has isn't convincing to rational people. He has to invent these excuses because he has to convince the idiots in the audience that they were right all along. Otherwise, the collection plates stop moving and he has to go out and get a real job. This is exactly why I insist that these people walk me through the steps, every single one, that convinced them that their gods were real in the first place. Every single step, with independent corroboration for that step before we move on. And they can't do any of that, which is the problem. Why? Because they will reach a point and then they just have to leap to, God done it. Because that is their irrational conclusion all along, reached for emotional, not intellectual reasons. Well, hold on there, Tex. Show me how you got there. They can't. They simply can't do it. That's why when you get to, well, it seems to me, and it just has to be true because it says so in my book, all of which are emotional reasons, not intelligent ones, that's where you've got to try to rein them in. But every single theist out there does this. Every single one, at least every single one that I've ever seen. If you can think of an exception, please post it in the comments below, because I'd really love to take a look.
If God were to show up to us all the time like a stalker, would we really be free if we wanted to ignore him and go our own way?
I'd put out a restraining order. Now, that's meant to be a joke, of course, but I would accept that this God was real because that's what the evidence supported. And I still wouldn't worship it because the God of the Bible is a complete douchebag. I go where the evidence leads, period. I could accept that there was a God out there somewhere and still not be part of any religion. That's something else that the religious simply do not want to accept because they're not after the truth. They just want converts. They want butts in the pews and money in the collection plate. That's really what this is all about. And I don't care about any of that at all. I want to know, to the best of my ability, what is actually going on. I will accept whatever the evidence shows is true, at least provisionally. But as I said, that's not what the religious are after. They just want money and adherence. And I think that's just stupid.
No. He gives us enough evidence, but not overwhelming. That's why C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tapes letter says, God cannot ravish, he can only woo.
Then he's a pathetic waste of time, and I want nothing at all to do with him. If he was real, of course, which I have no reason whatsoever to think that he is. So we're right back to square one, with Frank making excuses and presenting no evidence whatsoever. I know why I'm not convinced, and I know what kind of thing in general it would take to convince me. We're not even in the realm of bowing down to worship yet. That's a completely separate issue from acceptance of fact. Let's get to the facts first, then I'll evaluate the demonstrable character of this God thing of yours so I can see if he actually warrants my worship. And if it's anything like it says in the Bible, no, absolutely not. That God is a complete asshole, even if it is real. Fuck that God.
He can only give evidence that isn't overwhelming, so you still have freedom to go your own way.
And exactly how do you know this, Frank? That's a question you have to ask continually. These apologists are just making bald assertions that they cannot show are actually true, and they cannot demonstrate how they got to any of it rationally. They just really want to believe. And make money. You can't forget that part. Sorry, Frank, but I don't believe a single word that's coming out of your mouth. You haven't justified any of it to me yet. And that's the thing they're not even trying to do. That's why they only want to talk to people who already believe on faith. I think you're full of shit, Frank. Prove me wrong. Of course, he can't do that because proof isn't part of his vocabulary. Only faith is. And I don't care about faith. I care about facts, and I care about evidence, and since you can't show me how you know any of this stuff you're claiming to know, I am simply not interested. The problem here is you, Frank, not me. You're the one showing up to the gunfight with nothing in your hands. It's why you're a con man, not a credible thinker, not a rational person, not a skeptic. You people hate skepticism, and because of that, you will continue to fail and your audience will continue to fall away because you have nothing of any rational substance to say. I'd love to say that's a surprise, but let's be honest, it's really not. The world has passed you by, and you are a complete waste of time. And it couldn't have happened to more deserving scam artists. You people are idiots.